The Coastal GasLink protests heated up again this week, and it's not just an Alberta issue. To talk more about it is the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, the pipeline runs from Dawson Creek, BC to Kitimat. Premier Jason Kenney doesn't understand what the issue is since 20 First Nations groups signed on for the project.
Yeah, that's right. So, Premier Kenney was talking a little bit about these protests this week, saying that this is, sort of a dress rehearsal for what could come on TMX and other resource projects. So, I think the concern is that when TMX has, won a court challenge recently and construction should be going ahead, what we could see is similar protests, sort of holding up that project and things like that. This is in some ways, I think, a hearts and minds issue. So what we have here is protests sort of all over the country. There have been demonstrations in Ottawa, in Edmonton, in Vancouver, in Victoria. Protesters were before the legislature there. So it's not just the protesters who are sort of out at the block, who were blocking access to the construction site before police went and cleared them out earlier this week.
And he says it's also about Canadians imposing radical ideology on others?
Yeah, so that sort of goes back to what you mentioned about the 20 elected First Nations band councils that have signed agreements on this project. And what he's sort of suggesting is that a lot of the protests are not people who, have sort of a direct stake in this, are, environmentalists in Vancouver and San Francisco and what have you. So, and it all goes back to sort of this disagreement between the elected chiefs who are established through the Indian Act and the hereditary chiefs who claim that portions of the pipeline route go through their historical traditional territory. So it's just a hugely complicated protest in the case of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And as people know, it's been going on for about a year. And so it heated up about this time last year, maybe a little earlier. And the same thing has happened now.
You know what I've noticed about when I follow a lot of these stories too? You follow the money. That's the bottom line. A lot of times you follow the money, Tyler. Now, the dispute, speaking of the energy sector involving the Teck mine in northern Alberta, continues. A dispute has now emerged between the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation and the government.
Yeah, that's right. So the chief, Alan Adam, has sort of come out and said, there have been some issues with cultural and environmental concerns, having to do with water, having to do with caribou habitats, things like that. So he'd sent a letter earlier this week to other chiefs who were going to be meeting with the government and, sort of detailing some of these concerns. Now, as you mentioned, the money, some of the Alberta cabinet ministers, Jason Nixon, I believe, was on television the other day. And so they sort of went around and said, what this actually is about is the money. And part of the reason for that is the letter that Adam sent sort of detailed some concerns about these, about whether or not signing agreements in regards to an energy project was best, or whether or not there should be royalties given to the First Nations on whose land these projects are being done. Now, his First Nation, of course, has signed an agreement. I think it's one of 14 that have signed agreements with Frontier for Teck for the Frontier mine. So again, another sort of money issue, another sort of cultural issue. Another one not going away necessarily super soon, but the government is supposed to make a decision on it. The federal government is supposed to make a decision on it by the end of this month. So whether that happens or whether they push it back, we should find out in the coming weeks.
Alberta Opposition Leader Rachel Notley spoke about the Teck Frontier mine. Tyler, Notley has been quite supportive of our energy sector in the past. What about this time around?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, she still is trying to be supportive of the energy industry, but is also trying to walk this sort of fine line where she has the sort of same end goal as Jason Kenney in the UCP, which is seeing a project like this go ahead, but also somehow needs to sort of be able to say that the UCP is doing something wrong. So she is sort of pinning some of the blame for the delay in the project, that it hasn't immediately been approved. She's pinning this sort of dispute between the government and the First Nation on the government as well. So this has sort of been the tactic, I would say, that the NDP is trying to have to come up with on some of these issues where there's, degrees of difference in the end goals of the parties, but you kind of have to play politics with it if you want to stay in the game of politics.
The crude by rail contracts have been sold, Tyler. Now, this was an original idea of the NDP to get the oil moving. especially when there are not as many pipelines. 19 contracts have been signed, and the government is actually losing over $1 billion on the deal.
Yeah, so this cast your mind way back to, late 2018, early 2019, when there was this price differential where Alberta oil was going for quite a bit less money than some of the competitors. And the reason for that was you had supply backlogs and you had some sort of plant changeovers in the United States that contributed to it. The long story short is shortly before the election last year, the Notley government went out and the government signed lease agreements for about 4,400 um, tanker cars, and those were supposed to be used to ship about 200,000, I think, barrels of oil a day. Now, this was supposed to clear out this backlog, allowing more oil to get to market, prices go back up, so on and so forth. Now, the UCP was never in favor of this. They criticized it at the time. They promised to eliminate it when should they become government, which they obviously did become government. And yes, they have now started to unload them, saying that the government shouldn't be involved in this. Private carriers, private contractors should take over these deals. Yes, they are losing money. They are losing $1.3 billion. I believe the overall deal, though, over a few years was something like $11 billion that the government was set to spend. So they're losing money, but in the same breath, they're saving money as well. And the other thing is that when they planned on getting rid of these contracts, they had estimated it was going to cost $1.5 billion to do so. It only ended up costing $1.3 billion, so they saved about $200 million. So maybe that's the silver lining in there for the government.
A bit of a shock this week in that Premier Kenney actually said, I couldn't believe he said this, that we're going to have to get out of the oil and gas business because of climate change. And he says the last barrel of oil consumed in the world should come from Alberta.
Yeah, this was sort of a bit of a surprise too. This was on his sort of speaking tour out east, where he did sort of, he's been criticized, I think, for being insufficiently bullish on climate change and environmentalism, fairly or not. And so this was, I think, came as a shock to his supporters, came as a bit of a shock maybe to the people that don't like him either, that he sort of said climate change is a problem and acknowledged that eventually fossil fuels are going to have to no longer be used. Now, of course, this ties nicely in with his other line on all of this, which is that Alberta's oil is, produced at rigorous environmental standards, rigorous safety standards. It doesn't come from Saudi Arabia or Iran, things like that. So that's what he's sort of getting at when he says he wants us to be the supplier for the last barrel of oil. But I think it does speak more broadly to this issue that, and we've talked about it before, where he has a lot of things he wants to achieve that he needs the federal government to play along with. The tech mine is one of these things. TMX is one of these things where it's oddly, I think a critic could maybe go and say, oh, Jason Kenney is playing the social license game that he so much criticized Rachel Notley for over the past years. So again, fairly or not, I think that is part of his strategy here, is to not look like this, drill baby drill guy when he's trying to get concessions from other levels of government.
When I lived in Hamilton, Ontario for close to a decade, the city had to reinvent itself from steel town to become more of a hub, a training hub for many in the medical community. A lot of doctors and nurses come there to train and to learn. But we're talking about an entire province here. We've got some agriculture in Alberta, we've got some green technology, but how else can we replace hundreds of billions of dollars lost by the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think the answer to that is hopefully that we have like at least 30 years to do it. I think part of what he's saying is that this isn't going to happen at the snap of the fingers like some more extreme radicals maybe would like to see, but that there is time for these things to shake out. But honestly, I think it's a great question. I mean, you look at the amount, the percentage of the Alberta GDP that is linked to oil and gas, the amount of the Canadian GDP that's linked to oil and gas. And until someone has some pretty good ideas about how to fill those economic holes, in addition to the part where we need to keep our houses heated through the winter and things like that, it's not the easiest way forward, I don't think.
I'm almost thinking of it like when Connor McDavid went down for the Edmonton Oilers. It's going to have to be scoring by committee for the Oilers now. So maybe it's going to have to be revenue generated by many different industries, to make up the difference for the oil and gas sector, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. And then who knows, maybe that corporate tax cut that the UCP is hoping will bring investment, will bring all sorts of new businesses and whatnot into the province. I mean, you have seen parts of the United States that have revitalized, sort of Midwest cities and things like that, that have seen tech companies move in because they're, low rent, low cost of living, all those sorts of things when it's just too expensive to run a business in San Francisco or New York. So, I think there's some options here, but yikes, I would not want to be the person trying to plan this out long term.
Premier Kenny is back from his Montreal and Washington trips. He met with a lot of high-profile people, Tyler. Now, will Alberta receive a solid return on that investment?
Well, again, great question. I don't know if we know. So, there have been, you can take the cheap shot, I think, against the Kenny government here, which is to look at the expense reports where you have, X thousands of dollars being spent on hotels and travel and cell phone bills and this and that, and say, are we getting return on investment? And I think some people are doing that. And you can look at the other side of it and say, what are our employment numbers doing? What's investment looking like? And there has been some promising signs, I think, on the investment side of things. I think it is very difficult to draw a line between what Jason Kenney has been doing on these trips and what is happening with the Alberta economy. And part of the challenge there for him politically, I think, is it's hard for him to draw that connection, but it's also easy for the NDP to criticize those things in terms of that connection. So they can say, oh, employment numbers are getting worse. While Kenny's off spending all this money on hotels and things like that. Whereas Kenny then sort of has to say, well, no, I'm selling Alberta abroad. I was elected to do this. That's what I'm doing, so on and so forth. Quantifying that, I think, so far has been a challenge, frankly, on either side of this equation. And I should add that I think this is going to be a point of contention when the legislature returns in a couple weeks.
I'm thinking maybe he's thinking of it like a business as well. Sometimes you have to spend money to make money. As a former business owner, I can appreciate that pain. Now, the throne speech is coming up February 25th, which is the same time that the Ledge is back in session. We'll also have budget details announced shortly after on the 27th.
Yeah, things are coming back. So it feels like it never ended, eh? Like, we haven't seen some of the back and forth and question period and stuff like that, but gosh, things have barely slowed down. Over Christmas there was a break and that's about it. It's just been go, go, go. So, there are some things that we will expect to see this year. I think we're going to see some further sort of indications of what this longer term belt tightening is going to look like. That's obviously going to be a big theme in the budget. I think in the throne speech, they're going to have to talk about what they're doing to try and get the economy back on track. I think it's going to be interesting to see, very interesting to see how the Trans Mountain decision and that sort of thing is going to be framed, given that last week we talked about how Kenny had given some kudos to Justin Trudeau and is, being nice, playing a little bit nicer than normal. So yeah, there's going to be some interesting stuff to watch for as this all comes up, I think.
Tyler, only 8% of teens vaped between 2014 and 2015, but now that number is around 22%. There's going to be some new rules coming out to protect our young people against vaping.
Yes, indeed. So what they're going to be, we don't yet know. So there has been a report done that is sitting with ministers. So, speaking of the government coming back and legislating, this is probably one of those things that we're going to see come up, and governments come up with a way to tackle it. We are one of, if not the last place in Canada to come up with some of these rules. So that's something to be looking for. That's caused a lot of consternation among parents over the last year, I would say, in the United States and Canada, people getting sick. And there have been a couple of those sort of mysterious vaping lung illnesses that have popped up in Alberta. So that's one of the few things I think we can say with some confidence that we're going to hear a bit about in the next month or two here.
The Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me once again from Edmonton. Thanks again, Tyler.
Thanks, Hal.